So Chris and I got to know each other because we serve on the board of Give Directly Together. But he's done so many amazing things in his life. You know, one of the best parts of Google.org is that you get to meet people around the world who are really digging in the arena, fighting to make the world a better place. And Chris has done that in so many different initiatives, so many different levels. Google.org is working together with him on the Economic Security Project, and Andrew Dunkelman here in the front row, and Florian also here. Is Mahmoud here? Our economic opportunity leaders are charting Google's path as we support some of their work. So if you have questions, also look for Andrew at the end. But I thought it'd be helpful to start with a little bit of Chris's background for those of you who don't know him. So you may know that he was one of the original co-founders of Facebook. He was the head of new media for the 2008 Obama campaign and the former owner of the New Republic. But these days, what propels him most is his work on rethinking the social safety net to give everyone a fair shot. So I hope everyone was able to get a copy of their book. I was telling Chris, true story, that Andrew bought this book for me, and I put it on my nightstand, and I knew I needed to, get to it and read it before this, and of course I was going to do that. But when I actually opened it up and started reading it on the BART, I missed my BART stop because it is so well written,
Which is like
thoughtful.
The best compliment you can ever give an author, for the record.
I mean, I have a background in econometrics, and let me tell you, most of these books I can put down easily, and I always make my stop. But this is a phenomenally well-written, interesting, personal, thoughtful, data-driven book. So highly recommended. We have copies here for Googlers.
Thank you.
But Chris, why don't we start, because your personal history, your narrative, does really inform a lot of your thoughts in a lot of the book. So maybe just give us some highlights from your story, your personal story.
Happily. So in many ways, the book is a reflection of my own personal story, and then it leads up to why I believe a lot of the things I talk about all the time. So I grew up in a little town called Hickory, North Carolina. It's at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And my mom was a public school teacher. She taught high school math. And my dad was a traveling paper salesman, sort of the middleman between the big companies that manufactured the paper and small town printers. And we had just typical sort of small town middle class life. I went to public schools, and I was an only child. My parents were a little bit older. It was very bucolic.
Wasn't it literally like the town that Mayberry was built on?
My dad was born in Mount Airy, which is the setting for Mayberry, yes. And he grew up as the son of the groundskeeper for a golf course. So that was his trajectory. So I ended up going to, applying to a boarding school. I Googled best high school, well, actually at the time it was Yahoo search.
Yeah.
This was like the late 90s.
Long time ago, folks, long time ago.
Yes. I looked up best high school in America, ended up applying. I got financial aid to go to a boarding school, and then from there got into Harvard, got financial aid scholarship to go there, and got to know Mark Zuckerberg a little bit our freshman year, and then ended up roommates with him sophomore year. We started Facebook, and the Facebook story is somewhat well known, and the rocket ship took off. So my life, though, changed dramatically in the years after Facebook. I worked for 3 years there doing communications, marketing, and product, but I wrote the book because for 3 years worth of work, I got a boatload of money. I mean, when Facebook went public, it was nearly $500 million. And that is nothing but a lucky break. I mean, there's nothing
else. Your take of it was $500 million.
Yes.
Just to be clear,
yes.
yeah.
Yes, Facebook's happy.
Yeah.
But it was a lucky break. And so I wrote the book because initially I thought that my case was really unique. And I have come to believe that my case is in many ways extreme, but it's actually not that unique. That a small group of people are consistently getting lucky while everybody else has a hard time making ends meet. It's not to say 100 people are working hard, but only 1% is doing really well. And that is a specific decision that we have made in our economy to structure it that way. And we do really have the power to change it. So that's where the book came from.
I thought your whole view on luck was very interesting. So I thought I'd read just a little bit from the book on when you talk about this. You say that saying people get lucky is not a denial that they work hard and deserve positive outcomes. It is a way of acknowledging that in a winner-take-all economy, small chance encounters like who you sit next to at dinner or who your college roommate is have a more significant impact than they have ever had before. And in some cases, the collection of these small differences can add up to create immense fortunes. You know, I worked at the Gates Foundation before coming to Google, and Bill Gates also, I was always struck by how he said when people said, you know, what's the reason for your success? And he would say, number one would be luck. That I lived in a privileged family. I was able to go to a school where I had access to computers in a time when that was, you know, so, you know, recognizing hard work, but also recognizing the place of luck. And it seems like for a lot of folks, we don't want to have that conversation.
I think that's right. I think that we often divvy it up, right? We say, some people over here, they get lucky.
Yeah.
Like that guy, Chris, who roomed with Mark Zuckerberg, he's one of the lucky ones. Over here, we've got the people who work hard.
Yeah.
Mark Zuckerberg, he worked very hard. And never the twain shall meet, right? I think in reality, almost always the two people are both working hard, when we look at success, are both working hard and are fortunate. I think, you know, Fortune 500 CEOs, as I say in the book, are some of the hardest working people out there.
Yeah.
But they are benefiting from an economy that provides some disproportionate rewards. The janitors who work in those buildings or in a building like this are also working very, very hard. But the way that we've structured our economy means that, quite literally, we know from the economic data, they haven't gotten a meaningful wage boost in decades, in nearly 40 years. So one of the reasons that I wanted to write the book was to try to dispel this notion of luck being something that you know, is just one or two people, but instead there's a kind of fortune that the economy is providing to a small number of people while everybody else is having a hard time making ends meet.
Well, why don't we go right into your policy prescription for this? So you have an idea about expanding the earned income tax credit so that every working American who lives in a household earning less than $50,000 a year could receive a guaranteed income of at least $500 a month. So we're at this moment. Economy's humming along, unemployment's at an all-time low.
Yeah.
This would be creating a whole new entitlement at a time when we're talking about entitlement reform. So why this and why now?
Well, the numbers, I think, don't tell the whole story. You know, the stock market is at record highs, unemployment is near record lows, but you know, economic opportunity is also at a near record low. So what do I mean by that? I mean a sense that the people who do well for themselves will be able to pay their bills, and their kids might do a little bit better than they. The median wages have not meaningfully budged in 40 years, and the cost of living is up by 30%. And it's not just in the Bay Area or in New York, where we have all of these insane challenges with housing and transportation, healthcare, childcare. It's across the board, across the country. Wages are flat, life is more expensive, people feel like they can't make ends meet. And Donald Trump was obviously elected for a whole host of complex interwoven reasons, but I think one of the things that his election has done is been a wake-up call.
Yeah.
That people on the left and the right feel like the economy is not working for them, and that we have to do something differently. So in my view, sometimes the best solution is the simplest. Cash, cold hard money, put in the hands of people who need it, provides more economic opportunity, we know from the evidence, and is remarkably efficient in offering that opportunity. And it can be the kind of thing that we do. So we can talk a little bit about the earned income tax credit and the frameworks, but at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is embracing the dignity and the freedom that I think everybody should have to be able to figure out what they want to do with their time, what they want to invest in. And cash is unlike any other intervention in that it doesn't say, you go here at this time, you got to go to that government office to fill out these programs, we'll give you these SNAP benefits, but don't buy any fish with it, or all these kind of crazy restrictions. Instead, cash says, you are the master of your own destiny. And I think it's a fundamentally respectful way of empowering people that we also happen to know works very well.
Well, let's dive into that a little bit. I mean, we bonded on GiveDirectly's board, so we're, Google.org has invested in GiveDirectly as well. We're big believers in direct cash assistance, especially in developing countries. But what's the evidence base that in a place like the United States that this kind of aid is going to be the most effective?
So I came to this whole issue actually from the perspective of philanthropy through the GiveDirectly lens. And specifically, after Facebook's IPO, my husband and I made a commitment to give away the vast majority of our wealth in our lifetime. And so we faced this big challenge, but one of the biggest first motivating questions is, how do we get the most bang for the buck?
Yeah.
Yes, it's a lot of money.
However, if
you're going to give it away, you want to give it away well. And in some sense, it was overwhelming without that kind of heuristic. I'm sure some people in this audience or on the live stream have experienced something similar where there's no shortage of causes. I mean, I could go through a whole list of things that we care about, but one way of narrowing it down is okay, well, if we care about poverty and economic opportunity, what's the most efficient way to help? And I went through the international door initially through GiveDirectly, and I have a whole chapter in the book about a journey that I took to check out several different programs, and I really came to believe that cash, dollar for dollar, is more effective internationally. There are well over 200 studies that have looked at the power of cash. For those of you who are there's a great synthesis of all of them in an Overseas Development Institute report that got put out last year, which is fantastic. Shows that health education improves. Not to say we still don't need hospitals and schools. However, on balance, I think we should be asking if we're going to invest, a dollar in a hospital, might it be better to provide that dollar in cash for people to be able to go and find the health resources that they need? So I came in through the international door, became convinced by the evidence, and then took a step back and said, well, if this works in Kenya, why can't it work here? And in the US, there is less evidence, but still significant amounts. We have a small guaranteed income in Alaska. The Eastern Band of Cherokee have one, and then majorly there's the earned income tax credit. We have the largest cash transfer program in the world, and we know quite a lot about what happens when you provide people with money. So I really came to see it as the most effective way to provide economic opportunity in a time when a lot of other people, mind you, are coming to the issue of UBI more from the frame of artificial intelligence and automation and self-driving cars and rise of the robots, which is a different door. It can take you to a very similar kind of solution, but it's a different way in.
Yeah. So what's unique about your proposal as well is that whereas a lot of UBI advocates are just saying everyone gets this amount regardless, you believe in having a work element to this. So why don't you just speak to that? Why do you think work's important? Why would you weave that in?
So a lot of this is grounded in the context in which I grew up. In the world I grew up, everyone was working in some way, and people wanted to work. Now, it was often in the formal economy. It was sometimes not. So I believe that people in America, the people at least that I've met, and the empirical evidence I think also shows this, want to be of purpose to themselves,
Yeah.
their families, or their communities. This is just like a fundamental belief of mine, that there is a myth out there that like people just want to, I mean, particularly of the welfare queen, right?
Yeah.
Like this is the Reagan idea that all these, people they just want to live on the dole. If people, it's a, if people have enough money, they're just gonna hang out.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see that. And I think psychological evidence shows that people want to be of purpose. They want to be in touch with their communities. I think there's an immense evidence base that shows that people want to be of purpose. So my view is, if you are working, whether it's in a traditional job or an untraditional one,
Yeah.
you shouldn't live in poverty.
Right.
Sounds like so obvious, right? I know, but it's not true. It's not true in America today.
And by untraditional, you also include caregiving, which I think disproportionately impacts women around the world, and in the U.S. as well. Women do the largest share of childcare, but then also elder care as well, and a lot of times that sets back their economic situation. And so I think one of the interesting things about your proposal is that you would equally value caregiving.
Yeah, I think specifically we should say, if you're at home taking care of young kids, we should recognize what you're doing as the work that it is. If you have a dependent over 70 who you're primarily responsible for, I mean, we have so much evidence to show as baby boomers grow older, people are literally dropping out of the workforce to be able to stay at home.
Yeah.
Because it's cheaper for them to do that than stay in the workforce and pay for nursing home fees. So that is a kind of work which right now our government does not recognize. You got to go to Burger King and get a minimum wage job, and then you're working. But if you're taking care of your aging parent at home, that doesn't count. I think that's wrong-headed. I also think education is work.
Student,
so being a student is, I was on financial aid. It's always hard to do the counterfactuals, but I didn't drop out of school to go work on Facebook full-time. I didn't even really have that as an option. I mean, it wasn't like I was going to move out to Palo Alto and work at Starbucks and during the day, and then at night, I mean, people do, but that was not, I liked college. I liked the opportunity. So, I decided to stay in school. But I think, a lot of college students today already have a guaranteed income. It's just
Mom and dad.
provided by mom and dad, exactly.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who don't. And so that is how structural classism and the racism that overlaps with that, I think, do get passed down generation by generation. When some people don't have to work, they can just focus on their grades, they can get good grades, get a good job, et cetera. So I think we should take to get to your question though, I think we should take a very broad definition of work, not the kind of cynical work requirements that end up cropping up in a lot of political discussions, but instead say, if you're doing something for your family or your community, which I think is effectively everyone,
right?
Then you shouldn't live in poverty.
Yeah. You touched on just a minute ago how a lot of folks, especially from sort of Silicon Valley, are coming to UBI through the lens of fear around evolving nature of work, automation, rise of the robots, whatnot. But that's not your perspective, or that's not the doorway through which you walk to get to a guaranteed income.
It makes sense to me. I mean, why people are extremely concerned about artificial intelligence and the changing nature of work. I'm just focused on the here and now today, and we already know that automation and globalization have torn jobs apart in America. I mean, in the past decade, according to Princeton economists, 94% of the jobs that have been created have been part-time, contract, or temporary. So in other words, they've been fundamentally unstable. So yes, there is work, and yes, unemployment is low. However, if people don't have fundamental economic stability in their lives, they live on the brink. And we know a lot from psychological evidence about the stress that introduces, which we can talk more about if it's of interest. So it's not that I'm very much inspired by the idea of of a UBI that provides everybody, I mean, not just people who are making 50,000 or less, but everybody the kind of financial security that they deserve. I mean, particularly in a world where there's mass technical unemployment. I mean, that I think is something very, very serious to think through. I just don't want us to like hang out and wait for 2040.
Yeah.
I think we need to make a down payment. We can and should make a down payment today in modernizing the earned income tax credit, making it monthly, creating a kind of guaranteed income for a lot of people. And then if and when jobs are wiped out wholesale, then we have a framework in place. And it's much easier, just like with Social Security, it started small and then got expanded over time. Similar idea. Let's start in a more modest way than a true UBI and build over time as the challenges arise.
I want to just pick up on something you just mentioned, which was the immense stress and strain that comes from living from paycheck to paycheck and at the margins financially. If you don't mind, I'll just read a little, some of the data that you put in your book. So there was an experiment done where there were poor and well-off participants, and they scored equally well on an intelligence test beforehand. And then they were asked what they would do if they had to deal with $300 of unexpected expenses, and then given an intelligence test. And it stayed about the same. Then they changed and said, okay, well, how about if you had a $3,000 in unexpected expenses? And the IQ for the well-off participants didn't drop in the next test, but for the poor participants, it dropped 15%. Just because, if you think about their brain having been primed, or and immediately just needing to deal with that stress and that anxiety, and thinking about it even in just a theoretical way, and how much that affected their decisions.
Yeah.
I was telling Chris beforehand, there's a book that's been making its rounds around Google.org and the Grow with Google teams called White Working Class by Joan Williams, which is a great compliment, I think, to this book, because just taking us through some of the realities of class and structure.
Yeah, and while we're in the business of recommending other books, the other book that is on this topic too, that, this one, but I was going to say is another book called Scarcity.
Okay.
By Sindel Muanthane, and Elder Shafir, who have written, it's an incredibly well-documented book. I mean, I chose this one study to cite in my book from their book, but it's full of stuff. I mean, they go through, specifically it studies the effect of scarcity on the brain and decision-making power.
Yeah.
They make some positive arguments. When we have scarce time, it can be good for us. If you only have 10 minutes left in a meeting, everybody all of a sudden zeroes in if there's still stuff to get done and, puts everything aside. But it's often very destructive to the brain too. And they look at the study that I cite, which is in a New Jersey mall, but they go to the developing world too, and what it's like in the period before harvest for people who are living hand to mouth, and then the period after. So consistently, what I think, taking a step back, what we see is that poverty actually has a physical effect on the body and a very real effect on the brain as well. There are some folks out there who are studying specifically for children who are raised in poverty. There is some reason to believe that the brains are actually wired differently than for families who are non-poverty. So this is, we tend to think, well, poor people, why can't they just, when I say we, many people tend to think, poor people, why can't they just figure it out? Why can't they just like, why don't they just go to school? Or, I did it, so they should be able to do that. And, there are fundamental, I think, questions about, okay, with what resources, how do you, to go back to school, let's say, you've got to be able to pay $1,000 for the tuition at a community college. You've got to be able to make up for the lost hours for the job that you don't have.
There.
You got to be able to get there with gas money, and you got to figure out childcare, which, by the way, the costs are skyrocketing.
Yeah.
And so, it's like, well, clearly people should just be in education. That's not to mention that when you show up for class at 7 p.m., which is connecting to the point, psychologically, there's every evidence to believe because you have been juggling 8 million things all day, you actually may be, we all have know our moments in our days when our mental bandwidth is less. And if so much of it's already been used up. So it's so easy to say, well, people should just be able to take advantage of opportunities. But I think we have to have a little bit more of a
so your argument
nuts and bolts
is
conversation about how it
giving
works.
folks at least enough of a floor to stand on.
Exactly.
To help them. So stepping back a bit, and I'm going to ask just a few more questions, and then we're going to open up the mic for live questions, and I think we have some on the Dory as well, but the Dory's not working yet, but we'll get there. All right, so stepping back a bit. So last year was defined by a growing Techlash. So as a tech founder yourself and someone who thinks a lot about inequality, what do you think is the role of tech companies like Google?
Top line, I think that the skepticism about the role of companies like Google or Facebook is going to be healthy in the long term. Mm-hmm. I think it's overdue. We've talked a lot about the opportunities that companies like this one and Facebook provide, which has been important and constructive. We have not talked enough about the responsibilities that companies like Google and Facebook have. And I think that, there are responsibilities that it's possible to talk about at the company level, and then there are responsibilities that it's possible to talk about at the level of individuals and leadership. So, Facebook in particular is going through on the first set on the company side, although Google too, to some extent, on making sure people hear people that they disagree with. Don't just log on and here's the filter bubble problem. Certainly to make sure that there's room for healthy debate of political kinds of issues, and it's not just about entertainment and ads, and definitely to make sure that foreign powers can't hack our elections. I mean, that's wherever you fall on however you interpret what happened in 2016, everybody, I think, should agree that there is an immense responsibility on the part of companies to make sure that nothing like that happens again, and on the part of government, which to be honest, in some ways I worry more about government because I'm not, unfortunately, convinced our elections are as secure as we think. But the companies, I think, are owning that responsibility. Then on the level of individuals, and just speaking on economic issues, that's where I think we all have a responsibility to talk about the way the economy is working and the opportunities that people like the ones in this room have, and what that does or doesn't mean for the people who make, your lives, our lives, all possible. So, it's fun to talk about a UBI in 2040, and I want to do that more. But let's not forget that, and not just on the guaranteed income, healthcare for all, higher minimum wage. Let's just not forget that these things matter immensely in the here and now, and with that comes a responsibility for all of us to figure out. We all have different ways of engaging, but I think we all need to be more.
All right, I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll open it up if folks want to start moving towards the mic. So, switching topics, I think one of my favorite parts about the book was your incredibly humble and honest discussion about your experience at the New Republic.
Yeah.
I know you were hoping I was going to bring that up.
I loved it. I think it's important to talk about failures and successes.
If you could just, for folks who don't know the summary, maybe just tell a little bit about that experience, and then also how it's tied to this very pragmatic approach that you just talked about, the here and now, taking positive steps forward.
Yeah. So after Facebook, I went and worked for President Obama for a couple years on the 2008 campaign. Then in 2012, I ended up buying a magazine called The New Republic. For multiple reasons. The most important one was I really believe in the power of journalism to not just hold people in powerful accountable, but to create a more civilized, educated discourse in our country, and specifically the kinds of journalism that the New Republic had historically done. If those of you who might not know the New Republic, some of you might, but it's sort of in the category of New Yorker or Economist, these kinds of magazines that
long thought pieces,
long form journalism, thoughtful pieces. New Republic always had a little bit more of an edge, but it was a kind of journalism that I wanted and continue to want to try to support, and I think particularly in a time of transition needed it. I did come in guns blazing though.
Yeah.
So after Facebook and
I think
Obama,
a lot of us have that tendency, maybe.
It's not, probably in rooms like this one. I wanted to figure out not just how to bring the journalism to new audiences of millions, tens of millions, but also how to find a sustainable business model for long form, highbrow kind of journalism. So we hired a lot of people. I invested a lot of money, millions of dollars. We, got bigger offices. We just did all of these things that, whatever you think we were doing with the, big ambitions, we're probably doing. And then over the course of several years, we weren't getting any traction.
Yeah.
The business, we weren't selling ads. I talk a little bit in the book about what we're trying to do. The subscription numbers, they bounced up a little bit, but we were hitting a wall in many ways. And my own desire to broaden the audience of the New Republic, I had a hard time communicating how we were going to do that and hold on to the values that made it special. So anyway, what ended up happening is I learned the hard way that the New Republic had always been a small print magazine with a circulation of about 35,000. It had never turned a profit. I think once in the 80s it did, and they brought pizza, and then it wasn't a profit anymore. So it had always effectively been a nonprofit dressed up as a company, and it was okay that it was for a small select audience. It wasn't going to reach tens of millions of people and be the next New York Times. So I learned that, and in some ways, the hard way. And I talk a little bit about in the book. I wish that we had made much more modest investments and really started from a very different place. So the reason all of this is relevant to the work that I do now is because I think before the New Republic experience, I would have been of the type to say UBI or bust.
Yeah.
It's got to be go big, go home. Like you gotta really
all those moonshots around here.
Yeah, and clearly I'm still very much inspired by that idea. Those values are the reason why I work on what I work on. However, I have no issues in having a more modest approach.
Yeah.
Because I think that embracing $500 a month for everybody who makes $50K or less is not necessarily the end goal. It is an important place to start, and even if it's there's been a couple articles that say, oh, this is too modest. I'm a follower rather than a leader on the issue, and if creating a space to try something modest is in my view, that's exactly where I want to be, is building that bridge, if you will, to the future, rather than letting the ideal make the short-term gains impossible. So that's how it's sort of relevant to the work I'm doing now.
All right. Well, let's take our questions. Do you want to share your name with your question?
Sure. My name's Max. Thanks for coming. So it seems like your plan really focuses on the national version of EITC. A lot of states, including California, have EITCs as well, and we expanded ours recently. Few people know, actually, that San Francisco and New York City also have very small EITCs.
Yes.
San Francisco's has been cut in the past, and I think there's an opportunity. We have a mayor election and a general election in November. I'm curious if you think there's opportunity to advance those kind of problems on a more local level as well.
Absolutely, is a short answer. I mean, I think I do talk a lot about a national policy in the book, and it's only been 6 months since I finished the book, but I would if I could rewrite the book in real time, I would spend more time with the kinds of near-term things that can be done, because I definitely don't want people to think, we got to just go national or go home. So there are EITCs, earned income tax credits, in the States. And by the way, even though it's called a tax credit, the way that's experienced is people just get cash. Tens of millions of Americans just get a check in the mail, and it's because it's refundable, which means that it's lived as a kind of annual influx of cash. So in the book, I make the case for making it monthly, the bigger definition of work, and also making it flat, so people know what they're getting. Right now, it's very hard to know. You can get different amounts where you live, the size of your family, how much money you made, et cetera. So there's a lot to be done in the short term. So cities absolutely can lead the way. San Francisco, New York, Mayor Michael Tubbs, who is in Stockton, California. If you guys don't know this guy, go Google him, because he's the youngest mayor of a major city in the United States. I think he's 27 now. He is a phenomenal leader. He is running a demonstration with the group that I co-run, Economic Security Project, to provide guaranteed income to people there. We'd invite more people to talk about what's going on there. Love to go to Stockton together. There's so much work. So really, if people are interested in that, I'd love to talk more.
Stockton trip?
The Y Combinator is doing a study. So there's a lot on the city level. And there's a lot on the state level too. EITCs do exist at a state level. I think the key is not just making them bigger. Sure, that's important. But really modernizing them so that, the key challenge, I think, in the gig economy of today is the fundamental instability of income. And so providing it monthly, even if it's only a couple $100s, can, in my conversations, really provide important stability. So there's work to be done at a state level, and then in the long term at the federal level too. But there's no shortage of places to roll up our sleeves and get going.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, from the Dory. So in your book, you recognize that philanthropy alone can't support a guaranteed income. Quote, all of the money that billionaires have committed through the Giving Pledge would only fund a guaranteed income for a single year. So what's the most helpful role that philanthropy can play to advance this idea? Philanthropy
can do so much. So it's important to say, it's not like we could fund a guaranteed income through philanthropy. So I make that point in the book. But there is a real need for more philanthropy in this space. Mm-hmm. A lot of people talk about UBI, and I've been working on this for several years now, and there's a lot of talk, and a lot of interest. There's not as much money as you would think. Fortunately, Google.org is helping us not necessarily think through a UBI, but thinking through the way the EITC can adapt to the future of work today. But I think that we need a lot more people to invest in this space. So, for instance, we have a match out for Stockton, where we funded the beginnings of the guaranteed income pilot there. There's a lot more funding there that is required. We need research. I am not an economist. I do love economics, but we need think tanks thinking through how to do this. We need to talk about there are other ways to attack this problem. You could put a tax on carbon and distribute the revenue as a dividend. You could think about a financial transaction tax. You could think about all kinds. So there's so much need for philanthropy to catalyze and develop the conversation. And part of what I do every day is to talk with people who are interested about this, to move it. It's just not the way that we can fund it in the long term. There's literally, if you took half of all the money that from the Giving Pledge combined, it would fund a guaranteed income for a year. Yeah. And then be gone. So powerful, however, public policy has to be the long-term
Focus
solution.
on the catalytic work. Let the government.
There's no other way the numbers add up without it. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks for your talk. You defended the work requirement a little bit ago, early on in the talk, by saying that people want to work. If they want to work, why have a work requirement?
I think, a couple of things. So the way work requirements as a phrase is used is usually somewhat cynically to try to throw people off of roles. I'm much more interested in expanding the definition. I have found in my own work at the Economic Security Project, people don't understand the idea of cash unless it's in some kind of symbiotic context. So by that I mean, I'll take my parents as a good example. Like my dad, particularly in the early days, he's like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
You just get cash? Like, why do I get it? Where does it come from? Like, is it going to keep coming, or does it run out? And like, when am I going to have to pay for it eventually? And my dad's a pretty smart guy, and it just conceptually didn't make sense. Similarly, I've been in North Carolina and Mississippi and in California and Alaska, all across the country, and people really struggle to understand the idea of just manna from heaven, cash that comes from the clouds. However, if you say you are struggling to make ends meet in some way, and you deserve to have economic opportunity, and cash can provide that, you go from having a group where it's furrowed eyebrows, confusion, I don't get it, I don't support it, to people being like, yeah, that is fundamentally what the American dream is about. So, in my view, the conversation about work is really a way to recognize what everyone is already doing, and a way to invite people into understanding why we should not have poverty in the United States, or why we should provide economic opportunity through cash. And in my own experience, it has moved the needle so much and made the whole idea of cash much more understandable and approachable. And so I think it's really an asset for those of us who believe in the power of cash to use in the long term.
So politics. Thank you.
Say it again.
I said, so politics.
No, wait, come back, because no, that's not what I'm saying.
Well, I mean, as opposed to a negative income tax, which I think is as easy to explain, but you have a harder time defending. And when you get into the work requirement, you have to deal with what is work and how do you get all of those untraditional jobs like caregiving to be recognized, right? If you skip over that, you don't have to deal with that. So you're taking on a logistic, and I guess you're arguing that it has some explanatory power to do that?
No, well, two things. I think there's conceptual clarity. It's not politics is one route, and that is sort of what sitting politics. That's not actually so much what I'm interested in. Like, people just don't. I would challenge you to ask people. I was in a public housing outside of Jackson, Mississippi, 2 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And you ask people what they think of a UBI or cash. It's sort of like it's such a foreign concept, Whereas if you talk about a monthly earned income tax credit, that many of them were single moms that recognizes what they were doing. It's not. I'm not there to sell the idea to them. I was there to be in conversation to figure out if it could be useful. It makes a conceptual clarity that opens the opportunity to have the dialogue with people in the first place, not marketed as a kind of political idea.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm David Bourne. I work in consumer hardware sustainability with my colleague Anna. So I've, I think, personally come to largely the same conclusion you have about the way to proceed on this issue, but wanted to ask you about, is there room to evaluate the role of what it means to be an employer? What is truly a contractor? What should be an employee? What's core versus context? Even at Google, I think we all sit next to a bunch of TVCs and we wonder, oh, I thought they were an employee. So is there room to redefine the role of what it means to be an employer, and avoid some of the instability you talked about with the contracting gig economy?
I think so. I mean, there's an important conversation to be had about what's the relationship between an employer and an employee. When is contracting really contracting? When does it not smell exactly right? Like, when is the relationship actually really different? I'm very interested in the expanded definition of work, though, that brings in so many of these people who aren't even in contracting relationships. So for me, it's like, if you're on payroll, or if you're part of the gig economy, or if you're doing some kind of work that isn't recognized, then that should be all recognized as a kind of work of sorts. That's the way we talk about it. So in terms of the opportunity to redefine that relationship, I think that's an important thing that we need to do too. But it's a little bit out of my area of expertise.
Let me do a quick one from the Dory, and then we'll get yours. So here's a question about the phase out. So your program would give $6,000 a year to people earning a little bit less than $50,000, and $0 to people earning $50,000 and $1. First of all, is that right? And then, are you concerned about work disincentives arising from this cliff?
No, with all of these things, we have to have some kind of cliff. So cliff is the policy term, so that when you don't have this kind of weird perversion in the of like employers paying $50,000 and $1 or $49. So we worked with the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy to think through all of these numbers, and one of the key things is figuring out exactly where does that cliff begin. Does it begin at 48? Does it begin at 47? Does it begin further on down, and how far down does it go? So the numbers that I had for the book are in many ways a first kind of provocative attempt to get the conversation started, and then one of the things that, thanks to the support of Google.org, the Economic Security Project is doing is literally answering this exact kind of question. Like, how steep should the cliff be? This idea of moving $50,000 around so it's different in California versus Mississippi, for instance. How would you factor in cost of living? There are a lot of even more granular technical kinds of questions. But my hope with the book was to invite more people into the conversation so we can have more minds thinking about it. But I do think $50,000 is a not by any means an arbitrary kind of number. It's very much where I think we can afford, and I think it captures a lot of people who are in the lower middle class right now, who technically aren't in poverty under the statistics, but who often can dip into it and then dip out of it. So
and you can fix the marriage penalty that way too.
Well, the marriage penalty is a big question, right? One of the things that I really believe in strongly, and one of the virtues of a UBI and the conversation, is that every adult gets it. And there was, we had all these UBI experiments in the 70s, and there was a sense that in one of them, in the Seattle experiments, that divorce rates went up. And at the time, it made people skeptical of it. But now, from our vantage point, a lot of people, particularly women, say, well, no, that's indicative of a sense that people could exit relationships they really didn't want to be in, because they knew that on the other side of it, they would have some financial security. So I do think that this should be on a per capita basis, on a per person basis, to really embrace the individual freedom for people to be able to deal with. We have all kinds of marriage penalties and allowances in the tax code now, and this would, when and if we get to a moment when this is being actually implemented at a federal level, then I think we have to think about how it's going to interact with those. But the fundamental value that I do think is important to hold on to is that everybody gets it. It's recognizable, it's the same amount, and that you have it even if you decide you want to leave a relationship that isn't working.
Hi, I'm Krishna. Sorry, I haven't read your book yet. You probably have the answer there. What is the international comparison for this? Is there any developed countries that have, something like UBI? And how are they raising money in terms of taxation, and how are they distributing the money? Is there an international comparison?
So there are a lot of countries thinking about it, but no country that really has a long-term guaranteed income for now. But we're in a moment. This idea is old. It's been around hundreds of years, but it tends to come in these patterns where lots of people pay attention to it, and then it fades, and then it comes back. We're in one of these. We're on the upswing. Finland has a big experiment. Ontario, up in Canada, has an enormous $100 million, the biggest one. There's Give Directly is running a pilot in Kenya. The idea is being explored in a really serious way, but it's still on the forefront of of where we are. So the short answer to your question is no country right now. Iran has a small one that was established, but inflation has taken it so far that it's minimized it so significantly that it doesn't really.
How
doesn't
about
really count.
Alaska with their oil checks or something, dividends?
Yeah, up in Alaska, we have something close. There's a guaranteed check. It's not so much a guaranteed income. Every year, every Alaskan gets $1,500, which is huge. If you have a family of 4, every Alaskan. So if you have a family of 4, you're getting a check in October of $6,000 every year. If you think about median incomes, that's a boost of about 10%. So imagine whatever you make, getting an extra check of 10%, it's meaningful. So we know some about what people do with it. We certainly know that people love it. They don't have an income tax or a sales tax up there. Alaskans would rather pay a sales tax by a factor of 2 to 1 than see their permanent fund dividend, that's what it's called, disappear. So it's very powerful. It was started by a Republican governor 40 years ago.
It's funded out of oil?
It's funded out of oil royalties. It's a fantastic.
And no one
reference
thinks of it
point.
as welfare. They just think of it as their entitlement because they are Alaskans.
Yeah, it's a common inheritance. They do. Yeah, that's right. It's like it's something that everyone gets and everyone is due.
Yeah.
Maybe
Maybe we'll take our last question, and then Chris might have a few minutes afterwards for
Sure,
folks.
happily.
Hi, my name is Garrett. Thanks for speaking today. The question I had was, for someone that's been successful with Facebook, a lot of folks might say, great, this person must know what they're talking about. Let's listen to them and let's hear what sort of policy recommendations they have. And your experience with the Obama administration. The question I have is, how as a white male would you, and in the United States, fold in or at least overcome some of the blindnesses that you would have to being in that role, right? I mean, certainly you can make recommendations. You can say, let's be the academic here. Let's look at the data. But I've also heard this morning that you've talked a lot about, I believe this, I believe that. And those beliefs come from somewhere. How do you kind of overcome that in making those policy recommendations when so many people are listening?
Well, I don't think you ever overcome it in the sense that we all have our subjective experiences. And, the color of my skin offers a privilege, which we have to be honest about. Certainly my economic perspective offers a privilege. I grew up in a different setting, but it very much does now. I think the fact that I'm gay gives me different, goggles to think about the world and to some extent about economic issues. But at the end of the day, I think it's only through dialogue, and it's only through the people that we support, particularly through the Economic Security Project. We invest millions of dollars into leaders who are out there who teach me every day from their perspectives. And Mayor Tubbs is a good example of one. I was mentioning him earlier. He's African American from a city that is very diverse. It has not been historically led by African American people, and the people who are potential beneficiaries of the program come from all different walks of life, all different races, all different kinds of backgrounds. So I think that the racial dimension of the economic injustice in particular is so often overlooked. I mean, 96% of the 1% are white. And if you look at the people who make $50,000 or less, it is significantly more people of color in that group than if you look at the population as a whole, because of inherited structures of racism and classism in our country. So I think that without acknowledging the importance of the intersectionality of all of these conversations, none of this is ever going to move forward. Because fundamentally, there's a question, I think, at the root of so much of this work, which is, can you trust people to, be the masters of their own destiny? And that question itself is so wrapped up with the history of racism in our country that we have to have this conversation ourselves. So I'm up here today and in general as a spokesperson for nobody except myself, and I hope we can cultivate, a group of leaders and conveners of these kinds of conversations who come from every walk of life. Because without that, we're never going to be successful, I think, in providing financial security to people who need it most.
All right, well, let's thank Chris. I want to say, he has a lot of things that he could do with his time and his money. And I really respect that he has decided to try to make America just a little bit more equal. So let's thank Chris Hughes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jacquelline.